Armstrong. I lead our product marketing organization at Snyk. I've been with Snyk for about 4 years. I'll give you a little introduction to Snyk here in just a couple minutes. I'm joined by Joe Farino. Joe, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Hi. I do DevSecOps and Vulnerability Management for the information security team at Dish. And my background is in threat intelligence, online investigation, and computer forensics.
Fantastic. Thank you. So what we're going to talk about is how Dish has kind of transformed themselves over the last few years and how they deal with zero-day events and application security events. And they use Snyk to do that, of course, which is why we're up here together. So it's a fantastic story to hear. I'll just do my quick spiel on Snyk real quick, and then we'll dive right into it. But our agenda today, we're going to kind of walk through this. We'll talk a little bit about how Dish Network uses AWS and how they use Snyk. We'll talk about how they deal with security issues, how they've kind of integrated this into the developer and DevSecOps workflows. So we'll get into how the real world works with this thing. But for those who haven't heard of Snyk before, Snyk is a developer security platform. So our goal is to take those application security tools that everybody knows and loves, but bring those into the developer's world, right? Provide information that a developer can use to just know how to fix an issue and not have to dig through long lists of security issues and security reports and then Google how to make the fixes. We want to provide that information directly to them. We'll scan your first-party code. We'll scan the packages and modules you're adding into your application. If you're containerizing it, we'll scan that. We'll scan the infrastructure as code for the deployments. All of that to help those developers understand what issues they may be creating and how to fix them. And also to give the security teams visibility. Are the teams handling these issues effectively, which teams are struggling a little bit, and which teams are doing really well. And of course, we have a great partnership with AWS. We'd love to share all the different things we do and integrate with AWS. We won't go through all those today in this session, but we'd love to share more about that. So everybody here, I'm sure, deep into AWS, Snyk will integrate with all of your AWS services as well. But Joe, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Dish and what Dish does? I know Dish from Dish Network and having, satellite TV, but Dish does far more than that. So
yeah, I think most people do know us for doing satellite TV in North America, but Dish does a lot more than that. We operate Sling. We built the nation's first 5G cloud-native mobile network here in the U.S., covering the entire nation. We're up to 70% of the population covered. And we have retail wireless brands, several of them. You can buy mobile devices from us and connectivity from us. We also have on-tech smart home services. So you can buy smart home devices from us, and we do in-home services to install them and configure them for you.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So it's far more than just delivering satellite TV, right? You got cellular networks, you've got streaming TV, you've got all these other kinds of services. Tell us about the application environment and kind of what that looks like
Yeah, so as you can imagine, we have a lot of developers at Dish. Last I counted, we had over 3,000 contributing code to all of our projects. That's several hundred applications that we develop in-house, and we're deploying over 70 different vendors' applications in-house. So we have all the integration teams that work on that. Several DevOps and platform engineering teams, no centralized control, so kind of each business unit has their own teams that handle it. Which allows them to be agile, but it's a problem for security. It makes it very hard to do our job. Our apps are deployed on-prem, some are hybrid, and a lot of them are in the cloud. If you can think of a way to do DevOps, somebody at Dish is doing it that way. And if you can think of a programming language, somebody at Dish is using that programming language. So we have a very wide array of doing things.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a situation that I think a lot of people probably can identify with and probably have themselves. Quick question for you. So, you've got a few of your Dish peers here, and there may be some Dish peers who listen to this recording later. Tell us which of those groups are doing really well and which ones really stink at keeping their applications.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that, Jim.
All right.
But they know who they are.
I tried. All right. Well, but seriously though, tell us how Dish uses AWS. You mentioned building the biggest sort of cloud-native 5G network. Tell us a little about what that looks like and how you've kind of built that on top of AWS.
Yeah, so the entire wireless network is built on top of AWS, and we started that 3 years ago here in Las Vegas, was our first commercial operating market, and we've expanded to cover 70% of the population. Building that in 3 years was very, very fast, and AWS allowed us to do that, right? The flexibility it allows, the scalability it allows, the predictability it allows are all very integral to allowing us to do that. So that was a major accomplishment. Sling also uses a lot of AWS resources to provide their services, and OnTech does as well.
Fantastic. So it's safe to say, I think cloud is a key enabler for Dish and delivering your services and in your platform to people. You mentioned there are still some apps that are hybrid, some apps that are on-prem. You see more of those apps moving to the cloud, or more of the new apps moving, kind of being built?
Absolutely. That work's already underway, and I think we'll see more and more of Dish's apps move fully to the cloud, just based on the success we've had with the services that are using it already.
Fantastic. So, the fact that these apps are in the cloud or have moved to the cloud doesn't necessarily mean they're, quote unquote, modern apps, right? There's lots of things we can move to the cloud and they're still, monoliths. What are the applications like? What is sort of the breakdown of things that you would consider modern, whatever that means to you, versus other types of apps?
Yeah, I would say almost all of the teams deploying to the cloud, I would consider them modern. A lot of it is infrastructure as code. Almost all of it is actually. Once we get below or above the lowest development environments towards production deployment environments, everything is infrastructure as code. We need to make sure that if something were to break, we can roll back and redeploy what we knew worked quickly. And if you're using infrastructure as code to take care of everything, that can happen very quickly. We know exactly what that code did, we can deploy. So as long as we keep that code safe, we're in a good position.
No manual provisioning in those environments. Everything is
for most of it. So yeah, I would say about across Dish, at least 60% of the teams are working that way.
Yeah, great. And imagine you're doing checks of that infrastructure as code, making sure everything is secure and good. Yeah, fantastic. So let's talk a little bit now about how those apps are secured at Dish. And we're going to start by going backwards, about 3 years back, and how things used to be done at Dish, and probably another situation that's familiar to a lot of people. Maybe some people are still in this situation and working their way out of it, but kind of give us the picture of what it looked like several years back.
Sure, so Sling kind of paved the way for our use of the cloud, and then when we got around to starting to build the wireless network, there was a lot of executive buy-in, a lot of team buy-in for let's get security right from the get-go. We're going to make sure we do this right. We're going to loop security in to review the architecture of what we want to build. Security is going to approve every bit of connectivity our applications need. And then we started trying to build a network in 3 years, which made it a bit difficult for the teams to adhere to those principles moving forward. So development velocity always wins in that situation. They have to get those new features out. They have to make everything work together. And when we're telling them, slow down, you need to fix things, they want to move on to their next feature, right? So.
It sounds very sort of waterfall-ish, right? Like we're going to do things, and then everybody's going to check everything, and then we'll do the next thing, and everybody's going to check everything. And
yeah, so we didn't have our security checks in place after the initial design consult until right before they want to push to production. So when we're telling them, hey, you have all these vulnerabilities you need to fix before you can do that and move on to your next topic, they're going to say no. And then we're going to have to fight with them over it. So they're frustrated with security, we're frustrated with the app teams, but we understand if they're not bringing in revenue and seizing those opportunities, we don't have a company to secure.
Yep. And you mentioned that sort of trade-off there of the developers who want to move fast. The business probably wants them to move fast, right? Get the features out, get innovation and all those kinds of things, right? But security, who I would imagine was the bottleneck to all that. Developers, velocity wins out, right? What was sort of the effect of that? Like what did that kind of look like for Dish?
So I think a lot of the leadership was having us focus on what is the most critical things that we need to secure. So we had to focus on having those arguments. Development velocity is always going to win that fight, obviously.
So security kind of moved down further and further down the list. So it started out pretty high, like everything is going to go through the security checks, and then eventually kind of fell down the list a little bit, which again, sort of a common thing. And then there was a galvanizing event, which I think all of us fondly remember, that happened about 2 years ago, that I think sort of reset everybody's mindset on security again, right? So Log4j, Log4Shell comes out. What was it like at Dish Network dealing with Log4Shell in the environment you were at?
Yeah, so that was really painful at the time. I mentioned before it's kind of decentralized in our environment. So that turned into a large outreach project working with each application team to review their code, find out where they have evidence of using Log4j, and seeing if it was vulnerable. I mentioned we have several hundred apps, so you can imagine how long that took. So while we were going through it, we started asking ourselves, how can we do this better?
Yeah, so it sounds like it sounds like it was a kind of a wake-up call for everybody at Dish. What did you start to do differently once this Log4Shell thing hit?
So a member of our threat response team used to be a developer in the Sling organization, and they're kind of, I would say, most advanced team started looking for a solution for how they could tackle this with the threat response team. How can we find just within Sling, where's all of our code that has evidence of Log4j being vulnerable? So they started evaluating projects like Snyk together, and Snyk was willing to do a really generous POC with us. So we implemented Snyk and integrated it with all of our code repositories very quickly. We were surprised that we were able to do that in less than a couple weeks. Standing up all of the infrastructure required, standing up the broker for on-prem stuff. And we were able to use that to look for and find all of the instances within our code of Log4j vulnerabilities. So we know which teams that we needed to reach out to have them fix it.
Fantastic. So it sounds like a very common situation, right? And you mentioned before too, where you had all these different diverse app teams, right? And everybody's kind of using different code. They're using different tools. They've kind of got a lot of different things going on. I think we see that in a lot of Snyk customers, where the developers have some autonomy. They get to go out and kind of do what they want to do. That's what helps them sort of innovate faster. So getting the security tools into the developers' hands, I think, is a big part of it. But also that diversity and that sort of freedom to go do what you want to do makes it very hard for security to sort of stay on top of what is this team doing, what is that team doing, is everybody sort of keeping up with the best security practices in addition to all the other kind of tools and things that they're running. But it has to be baked into that DevSecOps process. Following Log4Shell, that was obviously a major galvanizing event for everybody, but following that, what kind of kept security at the forefront of, people's minds at Dish? What sort of kept propelling it forward?
Yeah, we saw similar issues like Spring4Shell shortly thereafter, where we had to repeat the process all over again. So we knew we had a gap there. As we were working on finding the vulnerable code versions, we had to figure out how to accommodate all of the developers working in different ways. So we needed something that was flexible enough to cover all of the languages we use and all of the different IDEs that our developers are using, so we could give them that real-time feedback to try to prevent fixable issues from getting deployed to any environment.
Fantastic. You mentioned too, I think there were things like FCC mandated coverage. There's lots of compliance things you have to deal with as well, right? There's, aside from just the vulnerabilities and things you have to deal with, loads of others.
We were holding on to a lot of spectrum, and the FCC mandated by a certain coverage date we had to have 50% population coverage, 70% population coverage. We also had device certification not problems, but deadlines where we had to make sure devices we wanted to sell were operating with our network before that manufacturer would let us sell their device on our network.
Yeah, fantastic. And so I think that was the point where you kind of started doing the POC of Snyk, right? You mentioned what were some of the factors in that POC that you were looking at? What sort of, I imagine there were other vendors that were part of it too, but what sort of drove the choice for Snyk and the reason why you sort of liked that?
The wide language coverage was a big deal for us. The IDE plugins, I already mentioned both of those. But another thing was the reporting, right? Out of the box, Snyk is giving us reporting that lets us know how our deployment is working out. We're seeing metrics on the vulnerabilities real time with each team. We're able to divide it by team. And our Snyk support agent is able to enrich information in that report with like which developers on each team are using the tooling the way we want them to be using it. So a lot of the metrics we needed to prove that Snyk was working in our environment were there out of the box, and that support responsiveness is important.
Yeah, that sort of reporting side of it, right? So great, we get all the tools in front of developers, but are they doing the right things? Which teams are doing the right things, which aren't? We sort of jokingly asked, to point fingers early, but it happens, right? I mean, certain teams do this really well, and other teams sort of lag behind, and we need to be able to see that. Something that, you and I have chatted about. Well, there's more coming from Snyk to sort of automate even more of that reporting too, which is which is great. Then, you know, you had another galvanizing event, little incident that happened at Dish. Sort of what happened following that incident that sort of continued?
Yeah, I can't really speak about what happened, but March was pretty difficult for all of us.
Yeah.
That had our leadership asking us, how do we make sure this never happens again, right? So we hadn't fully committed to Snyk at that point, but it gave us an opportunity to review again. We shouldn't allow developers to have preventable problems being deployed anywhere in our environment. And we have tooling available to us that could fix that problem.
Yeah, that prevention's a big part, right? I think the big thing that people sort of look for in shift left security tooling is the prevention and being able to measure that and see that people are preventing those issues, right? But when it comes to things like this and preventing, you know, incidents from happening, right, it's a big part of it as well. But also responding when there are issues that aren't preventable. So the POC went well. How did you go about actually implementing Snyk for real and get to the, you know, deployment and sort of usage by the masses?
Sure. So as a result of that incident, the business had to look at what applications are the most critical to Dish based on business criticality, and security had to look at the applications and say which ones have critical data types that we need to protect or other types of security concerns that we need to handle. So with that understanding, we were able to start rolling Snyk out to the development teams working on the most critical app, then the next most critical app, and so on. So we had a very risk-based approach to rolling it out.
Yeah, and I think that's a sort of a critical factor. I think there's kind of several pieces in there that are critical that a lot of folks are looking for. One is, you know, once you start to define that, what's the most critical apps, it's easy for people, from developers, security, business leadership, to understand, like, these are the riskiest things that we have, right? And the things that we need to protect. These are the crown jewels. Everybody kind of agrees on that. If there's a serious security issue, we're going to go fix it in the mission critical apps first. That's the prime objective. And then we're going to work our way down the list. So it sort of sets that prioritization. But this idea of risk overall, like if we think about vulnerabilities, which probably most of us spend more time doing than we really want to, the vulnerability by itself doesn't really tell us about risk. It tells us there's a CVSS score and a rating for it. But you know, log4shell sitting in a dormant repository is not the same as log4shell sitting in your, you know, the app, the Sling app that the customer is using that all of a sudden is defaced and, you know, gives you a bad name, right? So those are two different types of things, and you have to be able to kind of look at it that way and make sure that everybody sort of has this clear picture of risk. And I think that's kind of how it worked at Dish.
Yeah, during the POC, we had integrated with all of the code repositories. There were thousands of code repositories, but it wasn't evident to security in all cases which one of those were actively deployed projects, whereas the analysis of the business criticality and security criticality of all the apps that we had following that incident let us focus on, well, we know these apps are deployed, let's start there.
And you had some quick wins too once you started implementing, right, and getting people on board and starting to use Snyk. You know, kind of tell us about those.
Yeah, so two of the ones that jump out at me are one of our development teams has over 200 APIs that they maintain, and within 15 days of having access to Snyk, they were able to fix 9 unique critical vulnerabilities. There were 200 instances of those 9 unique vulnerabilities. So within 15 days, they had used Snyk to detect it and fix it without a lot of guidance from security and push the fixes out. In doing that, fixing the critical, targeting the critical stuff first, over 2,000 high priority vulnerabilities or high severity vulnerabilities were fixed, just as a byproduct of doing the critical remediation. Another team within 30 days that maintains about 20 different applications was able to fix about 800 high and critical severity vulnerabilities. So we saw rapid adoption. We were able to integrate with the code repositories of all the critical apps within about 60 days and start giving them reporting and have them start working on fixes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you know, as you think about these kinds of stats and using, you know, tools like Snyk and AppSec in general, how do you sort of measure the effectiveness? We were kind of talking about metrics before we started the presentation, but how do you measure the effectiveness, the return on your investment in, you know, AppSec in general and how it's working?
Yeah, so after the first 20 weeks of having deployed Snyk, we did an analysis of the first 8 weeks of the usage, how many new preventable vulnerabilities were coming into our critical applications, not deployed, but being put into the code, versus the 8 weeks leading up to hitting week 20. And we realized we had a 70% reduction in the number of preventable vulnerabilities making it into our code. So that's preventing it from leaving the developer's machine. When you're doing that, only one person has to be involved in fixing it, just the developer. Even if you're gating like a development environment deployment, now the entire team's going to be aware of that vulnerability when you hit that gate, right? So now at least 3 people are looking at it. You're wasting resources. So preventable, easily fixed vulnerabilities should be taken care of by the developer. That's Dish's position.
Yep. It's fantastic. And I think it's actually kind of a pretty mature metric. It's hard to, it's a great goal, and I think everybody has it, but it's actually kind of a hard thing to measure, right? We start with scanning repositories, we get a good baseline of vulnerabilities and everything that sort of exists already. But then we have to start looking at everything that's committed, every new change. Is there something introduced that creates a new security vulnerability, right? And is that fixed before it gets too far down the line? And those are challenging things to measure, even with all the right tools in place, right? Doing all these scans. So that's a very mature metric.
I don't want to use security resources to go after the easily fixable stuff. I want to help them with more complex fixes that they can't do on their own.
Yeah, exactly. So getting them to be able to do that very quickly and very early in the process, I think, is fantastic. Another part of that you just kind of mentioned or kind of touched on, so collaboration is a big part too, right? So great, we get developers to fix the easy things quickly, but collaboration between the developers and security teams and others, right, I imagine is a key part of how all this works. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, so as we were going most critical app, next critical app, by app team, we would create a communications channel with all of the members of that app team and their entire leadership chain. So we would communicate, this is the next step you have to do. Everybody submit a ticket to get access to Snyk. Let's get your 2FA, your multi-factor authentication set up so you can log in. This is how to set up your IDE plugin if you're having problems with it. If we're not seeing that you're using it in our report, like set up an appointment with our team. But it's all happening in the team's channel. So the entire team is seeing this messaging, so we're not doing individual outreach unless we have to.
You mentioned scorecards that you had set up too to kind of measure and show sort of
progress. A little bit more recently. Now, what we are doing is saying that there should be no 3-week period where our developers aren't using the shift left tooling. And Snyk is able to provide that data telling us which developers are using the shift left tooling in any 3-week period. So we have a usage scorecard by team that shows this is where the team's rank is, percentage of the developers working on those projects, that team's projects, using the shift left tooling in the last 3 weeks. So we can circulate that weekly to all of the teams using Snyk and say, do you really want to be at the bottom of this list?
I love hearing that, obviously. I think a lot of folks want to get to that state as well. I think you also mentioned, prevention's a key part of it, but then you're always going to have these vulnerabilities that you have to respond to, right? And I think that was sort of the next phase is like, let's get people to use this and start finding issues early and fix as much as they can. But now we got to get to this response time for these other types of vulnerabilities, the non-preventable vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you kind of get there? What were sort of the ways you sort of?
Yeah. So you can only get a certain level of fidelity that's insufficient by looking just at the code repositories for a lot of types of languages like Maven and Gradle. So we are moving into the CI/CD integration with Snyk, putting those gates in place at each environment and making them progressively more difficult to pass. As teams get used to that, we can increase the policy to make it harder and harder to get through those gates. But we don't want to start them off with, you can't get through with any critical vulnerability or anything like that. We have mitigating controls for a lot of those. So I don't want to gate people and have them be frustrated. I want to ease them into it over time.
So what's next? You started implementing Snyk. You're pretty far down the road, actually, but it's really only been a few months, I think. But sort of what's
about
next?
6 months now.
6 months, yeah. So fantastic progress in 6 months. How are you using Snyk today?
We mentioned we're getting into the CI/CD pipelines.
Yep.
We want to start We really want to start to use Snyk to get towards who's not doing patching and kind of put patching policies in place for the people that have more complicated fixes. Like if we see that they're using an old version of Spring, for instance, we want to detect that. We want to ask them how that happened. Do you have patching procedures that align with our policy? If not, let us help you develop them. Let us hold you accountable to them too.
Yeah, fantastic. And as you talk about some of these things you've integrated with AWS services, like part of the, the dish services that are integrated with AWS and Snyk, are you kind of bringing all those things together, Snyk, AWS, dish? Kind of how's that working? You mentioned like the wholesale and retail wireless and having lots of APIs. I think that they were.
Yeah, I think we're going to be increasingly moving towards serverless environments, and Snyk is able to scan all the code we're developing and deploying to AWS. So
great.
Keep doing that.
So just kind of summarizing, what are some of the key benefits so far that you've had, using Snyk in your AppSec program at Dish?
Yeah, I mean, the real key benefit is that we're allowing the developers to share the responsibility for security. Snyk is providing them the real-time feedback as they're writing code, saying, hey, that's a security issue you need to fix. It's easy to fix. Here's how you do it. We find that the teams using that shift-left tooling are introducing less defects overall, security or otherwise, by quite a bit. So we see that correlation. The teams that have all of their developers using the shift-left tooling in each 3-week period are just deploying so much fewer vulnerabilities into the code.
So what do you sort of see as the ideal state? Snyk hopefully is part of it, but the ideal state of DevSecOps at Dish.
Yeah, so we want to make sure all of our developers are covered. We didn't start off by trying to cover every single developer at Dish. We started off with those critical applications that were identified. We'd like to continue expanding that. We want to roll out infrastructure as code protection as well in the same way, shift left. We're currently not doing that. We're doing SCA and SAST. So infrastructure as code is our next target. Those developers will get a shift left solution as well. After that, we're going to be focusing a lot on the patching cadence and really securing all of the code and the DevOps tools and processes, make sure we're minimizing access to the tools and limiting the ability for people to make changes.
Yep. And then other types of tools. So we talked a lot about Snyk, but just AppSec tools in general for Dish. So how do you evaluate like what fits in, what doesn't, what's good? And
yeah, I mean, our security team is comically outnumbered by developers in our organization. So it has to be something that's we can deploy quickly, has to be something that has wide language coverage, has to be something that has IDE plugins for all of the IDEs our developers use. And we need to make sure that it's easy to maintain. We want good support as well. So when my people have problems, security can't be the only people to help. I need them to be able to reach out to the vendor for help too.
Fantastic. So what's left to do? What are sort of the remaining things that, I'm sure that's not totally done at Dish at this point?
No, we want to get 100% CI/CD integration for Snyk as well. I would say we're about halfway there at this point. Okay. But all of the apps we're covering with Snyk, we want to get that CI/CD integration done and start putting those gates in place for the ones we're not already gating.
Yeah, fantastic. Very good. Well, as we sort of get towards the end of our presentation here, what would be sort of your advice, again, just in general, for folks who are starting to do this shift left here, maybe in this closer to the state that you were in 3 years ago, where everything was sort of, very gate and sort of process driven there to where you are today? Like, what's the right way for people to get to this more?
Yeah, I would say don't underestimate the amount of communication you need to do up front with leadership, with the teams you're going to be rolling this out to. You have to make sure they understand their benefit. If they are fixing vulnerabilities that are fixable in the most efficient way possible, you're going to increase their development velocity. Less of their team is going to have to be involved in fixing this stuff. You need to make sure they understand how to get the guidance the tool can provide and how to take advantage of the tool in advance of giving it to them, right? Set up the communication channels early in the process. Make sure everybody's seeing that, have shared guides, Make sure when somebody has a problem with Snyk, everybody else can see the resolution, right? Or whatever tool you're going to use. So really getting out ahead of telling the organization why this is important and how it's going to help them as well as you, I think is the key. If you don't set that baseline, set that expectation early on, you're not going to be able to get in the middle of whatever they want to work on.
Yep, I think, there's several things I think you touched on, today that are critical. We see a lot of folks sort of stumble through some of these things, right? So I think the collaboration, critical part of it, right? Between developers, between security, between business leadership, everybody on the same page. Understanding, not just why these tools exist and why they're supposed to fix certain things, but even understanding like these are the critical apps, these are the most critical vulnerabilities we have because they're the ones that could cause us the most problems, and therefore that's why we're asking you to spend your time on these. For developer understanding, like if I fix this right now while I'm still in the moment, that means I don't have to fix it later. I don't have to remember what I was doing next week when the security tells me I did something wrong, right? And go back and sort of jog my memory. I can get it fixed right now, and that keeps me, moving forward very quickly. So lots of big things in there. I think the measurements, right, and being, a lot of people I think measure by here's how many issues we found. At least it's at the start, right? Here's how many vulnerabilities we found, and here's how many vulnerabilities we fixed. But that's sort of a crude measurement too, right?
Yeah, I think even at Dish, we really see the ROI as training the developers to write more secure code as they're writing the code. Like we want security to be integral, not an afterthought. The traditional security model is it's always an afterthought. I wrote the code, now I'm going to go do the security scan. I want them to get that real-time feedback and have the opportunity to fix it before they move on.
Yep.
It's impossible to remember the logic in your code 2 weeks later. I know I can't do it.
Yeah, I can't remember what I wrote yesterday.
Also a terrible coder, so that's not a good example.
Yeah. I think it's so true, right? And I think, having those measures and sharing those measures and saying, like, this is what's working really well, but also, like, some people are going to be struggling, but not just pointing it out to say, like, aha, you stink, but, we're going to help you through this. And that's where the more collaboration, right? The part of this goal is to free up your time as an expert to come in and spend more time with teams that are struggling versus just firefighting all these issues.
Having those slightly more communications channels helps there, right? Because if I'm a developer that's not doing well, I see other people on my team asking questions and getting the support they need. That encourages you to speak up if you're shy about it, right?
Yep, fantastic.
Everybody makes mistakes, not a big deal.
Yeah, it happens, right? So you're not going to catch them all the first time, but I think in our perspective, we see a lot of people. It's no different than sort of having bugs in your app, right? You're going to have bugs. Every app has bugs in it. Even it ships with bugs in it. But you fix the ones that are showstoppers. You fix the ones that are going to cause the biggest problems. And so security is in a lot of ways the same sort of thing, right? We're not going to fix every single security issue that ever gets reported, but we're going to fix the ones that could look risky.
The developer gets real-time feedback when a test case he's written to see whether his application is performing. They're getting that kind of real-time feedback. They know that they're supposed to be doing that as a part of their job. So this kind of a tool allows developers to get that same type of feedback about security issues. It works the same way.
Yep. Very good. Well, I appreciate you joining me on stage and sharing your experience and sharing what you've done with Snyk. I think it's amazing you've done all this in just 6 months. I think that's fantastic. We love to hear that kind of story. Hope everybody else picked up a few things today, and we would love to share more. If you want to come by the Snyk booth, we're here and can definitely share more. Snyk is also, like I mentioned before, a very close AWS partner. We are available on the AWS Marketplace if you want to use that as sort of your transaction vehicle. But we would love to share more about Snyk if you want to stop by. We're happy to take questions here too. We've got plenty of time.